All right, thank you so much. The next speaker is Dr. Sara Lancaster, and I'll stop the share here and you can take the reins, Sara.
Thanks, Josh. Let me get the correct screen up here. Can you tell me and make sure that I'm doing right? You should see my title slide.
Looks good.
All righty. Thank you, guys. And I sound okay?
Yep, sounds good.
All right. Thanks for checking those things before we get started. So we're going to talk residual herbicides in corn and share some recent research that we're still sifting through, kind of some final analyses, but I wanted to share with you guys tonight where we're at with that data. And then before we jump into that, though, I wanted to address this question because really, you know, quite honestly, this is probably the question that drives some of my research, a good bit of my research. And that is what is your opinion / solutions on how to keep crop production costs down with heavy palmer pressure and the potential threat? So I don't have a silver bullet answer to that question. I would tell you that if you're going to rely solely on chemical control and herbicides, you're going to continue probably to see that price go up. I would think that in addition, even if we start to incorporate some other concepts here, we're still going to have to spend a significant amount of money on chemical control for weeds like palmer. It just comes down to anytime you're in a contest or a competition, right? In this case, we have farmers and crop consultants trying to manage palmer amaranth, right? That's our contest here. Palmer is a weed that has tremendous resources, whether you're thinking about rapid growth, whether you're thinking about the potential for seed production and how many seeds it produces, or the genetic diversity and its ability to rapidly adapt and become resistant. So because palmer has so many resources, we can only expect that it's going to take a lot of resources on our end to overcome and to manage that palmer. So ways to think about managing your costs, crop rotation. Maybe if it works and you're in the right part of the state, cover crops can help suppress weeds and maybe be a lower cost way to get a little more effectiveness out of your herbicides. And then I think that what you'll see in some of this data tonight is one of the things that we can try to do is to try to, do our best, knowing that we all have a lot of acres to cover in a short period of time and a lot of pressures and things working against us, but doing our very best to optimize our application parameters for each herbicide application. So thinking about the things we're going to talk about today, thinking about, if I'm using residual herbicides, what is the best spray volume for my post herbicides? What's the best spray volume? What's the best nozzle? Should we be thinking about adjusting our driving speed maybe to get better coverage, things of that nature? Because the chemical input side is going to continue to ratchet up in cost, even and probably especially when we do, hopefully sometime in the next decade, start to see some new products and some new modes of action coming into the marketplace. So that's a great question. And like I said, probably the foundation of a lot of the things that weed scientists think about in our programs. So the slides I'm going to share with you, I do have a little atrazine update. We're going to talk about 2 research projects that my PhD student has wrapped up data collection and is really refining her data analysis on right now. So I've got kind of some rough cuts on the data to show you guys. So that's where we're going. All right, let's talk about atrazine. I don't know if Josh has talked much with you guys about atrazine tonight, but here is a list of what is proposed by the EPA after consultation with Syngenta and with counterparts across the federal government. This is the list that's being proposed as mitigations for atrazine in order to help this label be compliant with the Endangered Species Act. We don't have time tonight to go into all the details of the Endangered Species Act, but I want you guys to know that language like this is coming on herbicide labels as they get renewed or approved for the first time. So take a look at this list that's on this slide and recognize that most of those items on that list are soil conservation practices that are intended to stop runoff or reduce runoff. So much of these mitigation practices are related to things that will help keep the herbicides on the field, because in general, the agencies recognize that the invasive species are not in our corn or soybean or wheat field or grain sorghum fields. So if we can keep our pesticides on the fields, that will be the number one thing we can do to stay compliant. I do want to take a step through because the rate restrictions on this new atrazine label are probably going to be a little more complicated. So I want you to pay attention to the map on the bottom left-hand side of the screen. So you see that some of the country, much of the country is white. So those areas that are white do not have additional atrazine rate restrictions. The areas that are pink have sort of lower level atrazine mitigations. They represent, the pink areas represent watersheds where the concentration of atrazine in the environment is at a level that causes concern for the EPA, but it's not the highest threshold. The blue areas are watersheds where the atrazine concentration in the environment has crossed a extreme threshold for the EPA. So when you think about your rates for atrazine, Kansas is in the north, okay? And let's say we are in a pink watershed, okay? So that sort of moderate level of concern. Let's say you do have a highly erodible land designation. So, this is coming from your conservation plans. If you look at the rate of atrazine that you want to use, that rate then determines how many mitigations you need to choose from the list on the previous slide. So if you're under 1 pound, the expectation is for you to have 2 of those mitigations. If you have 1 to 1.6 pounds, the expectation is to have 4 of those mitigations. And then you can also see here, we have a new maximum limit of what can be applied before planting. And in this scenario that we were looking at, it would be 1.6 pounds per acre. So more restrictive for a lot of folks that are growing corn in the state of Kansas, and also a little more complicated to figure out what you need to do to get to that rate. We're not going to talk much about new herbicide labels, but here's a list of the 4 new products for corn that we had in the weed control guide for 2023. One thing to notice about all 4 of these new mixes, none of them contain atrazine in the premix. Even Calibra, which is a Syngenta product, basically they've got a formulation now that is Lexar without the atrazine to give farmers and applicators more flexibility to find that right atrazine rate. So Syngenta is trying to make it as easy as possible for us to stay in compliance with those new restrictions. If you want, you can grab a screenshot or a picture rather of this QR code here. It will take you to the online version of the 2023 Chemical Weed Control Guide, or you can just Google Chemical Weed Control Guide or K-State Chemical Weed Control Guide, and you'll find the electronic copy. If you don't already have a copy, or if you want an electronic copy as well. So the question that we led off with was related to pigweeds and Palmer amaranth, and not to sort of, put salt in anybody's wounds here, but one of the reasons that Palmer gives us so much trouble, in addition to those 3 characteristics that I mentioned earlier, is that if you look at the state of Kansas between April and October, we can pretty much germinate and have emergence of Palmer or water hemp anytime in those months, April to October. So it's not one of the things, and you guys are well aware of that makes polymer such a challenge, is that sure, you can put down a good pre, but you're still going to have some late flushes of these weeds. And so kind of the easy button answer here for what to do about these is to think about layered residual herbicides. Okay, so there are a few options for applying residual herbicides over the top of corn. So things like atrazine, so that's a group 5, that's a photosynthesis inhibitor. Our group 15 herbicides, those fatty acid inhibitors, things like harness, outlook, Residual, and dual. And then the group 27 herbicides, balance, and Callisto. As you think about which of those products you want to use, one thing to consider is how much water it takes to activate each of those herbicides. So some of those labels are fairly vague. Some of them are very specific. Okay, so those amounts are all related to, or largely related to, the solubility of the active ingredient. Okay, so more soluble, it takes less water to get it activated. If you think you're going into a dry season or later in the season when rains are less likely, you'll want to switch to products that have higher solubility and require less water. So that being said, the other thing to be sure and keep in mind is that application cutoff to post-emergence corn. So, it ranges from V2 for balance all the way up to 30 inches. Now, this 30 inches, I need to point out here, guys, not all acetochlor labels are labeled for application up to 30 inches. The only ones that I've seen that are the warrant label. So I wanted some data to back up that slide and to be able to give some more specific answers to a question that I was getting a lot the first couple of years that I was here. And that really was this question of which of these group 15 herbicides should I be using? And so Tyler, the young lady here sitting in the weather station in the picture, looked at 4 different herbicides: warrant, outlook, Residual, and dual. She applied them at Ashland Bottoms near Manhattan. So she had 5 dates in 2021, 4 dates in 2022, just trying to generate a range of environments. And the other comment I need to make is that if these rates look a little high to you, it's because we're really right on kind of that organic matter cutoff for a lot of herbicides. So we had to use kind of rates in the higher range there. So to look at this data, one of the ways that I had Tyler look at this is, what's the likelihood of getting a certain level of control? And so here she chose 80%, which, we could have a conversation about whether or not 80% control is actually enough weed control here. So let's think about these slides. So what we've got here is accumulated rainfall on the bottom, and then going up the side, accumulated soil growing degree days. So how much heat is in that soil to get the pigweeds to generate and to germinate and to grow. So things to point out, the acetochlor, okay, see this yellow region, that's where we had 90 to 100% control. So that region is pretty small for acetochlor. That region is small for dimethenamide, okay? Residual is the herbicide that had the greatest region of 90 to 100% weed control, really going across all of our temperature ranges. And in some cases, when we had cooler soils, going across all of the rainfall ranges as well. The last one here would be dual. So it's sort of in between. It follows the same general pattern as the acetochlor and the dimethenamide. It just has a little slower response to the rainfall. So dual can have more rain and still remain active. The other way we looked at this is the probability of the polymer amaranth reaching 4 inches in height. 4 inches being that sort of magic number on the label where pigweeds become harder to control. So this is a messy graph. Like I said, this is a rough cut on some of Tyler's data, but what she's trying to show here is how likely is that polymer amaranth to reach 4 inches in a given period of time. Okay, so this yellow is the non-treated. Okay, the yellow is the non-treated. And then what I want you to look at here is that out about, let's say 28 to 30 days here, we're starting to get some separation with the acetochlor treatments having a greater probability of being off-label, and the Zidua and the dual treatments having lower probabilities of being off-label. So again, the Zidua and the dual are just sticking around a little bit longer across all of those different environments in which Tyler applied them. Another key piece of Tyler's dissertation work has been to evaluate whether or not spray volume affects residual herbicide efficacy. So we know that we need to adjust spray volume for our contact herbicides that we apply to already emerged weeds, but there's a little bit of evidence in the literature that suggests that maybe spray volume can be used to improve the effectiveness of particularly grass control. So we wanted to see if that applied to Palmer amaranth, right? We're in a situation where this would be a relatively low cost way to kind of add another layer of protection from Palmer amaranth causing yield loss. So this was a fairly complicated study in terms of the setup. She had a total of 5 site years, 2 in 21 and 3 in 22. And she had locations ranging from an irrigated site in Colby to no-till rain-fed in Ottawa, and then irrigated and no-till in Scandia and conventional rain-fed in Manhattan. So she had a little bit of everything in terms of the site description there. She applied Resicor and Trivolt pre-emergence at 3 different spray volumes. So we started with 20, and we said 6 was the lowest we felt comfortable going and still getting a good spray pattern. And so 13 was the halfway point there. So to look at some of the data here, these are our data at harvest in 2021, that irrigated site out at Colby, no differences. When we looked at Ottawa, so this was the year and the location where it rained probably 15 inches during the month of May, the first month after she planted her corn. So that affected the results for sure. The thing I want to point out here is this Resicor bar that with a low spray volume that did have lower weed control in that particular study. If we look at 22, we did not see any effects of spray volume in 2022. When she was at Ottawa, she found that there was a little better water hemp control with Resicor compared to Trivolt. However, when we come to Manhattan and look at Palmer, there was a little better control with Trivolt instead of Resicor. One of the key differences here is that the Ottawa planting was timely. The Manhattan planting was timely. The Ottawa planting was delayed just because of rainfall and some logistical hiccups that the team had here this spring. So this is late planted corn and relatively dry after the corn was planted. At Scandia at harvest, there were no differences really with GPA again, but she did see different responses to Resicor and Trivolt, whether or not based on whether or not she had a post-emergence application. So when she had a 2-pass application to clean things up, everything looked great, greater than 90% control for both. But when she just had a 1-pass pre, the Resicor in Scandia performed better than the Trivolt. Yield loss, though, at the end of the day, there were no differences in yield among any of the treatments at any of the locations. So, it may be that in some situations we could see some response to GPA for our residual herbicides, but it's not going to be a consistent effect for Palmer amaranth control. So that being said, the conclusions we've got here for you guys, really look for more restrictive herbicide labels to come. The EPA has been sort of backed into a corner in terms of enforcing the Endangered Species Act, and it's going to trickle down, and it's going to affect us at the farm level. From the first study, we concluded that Zidua is, of the herbicides we evaluated, Zidua is the least affected by rainfall and soil temperature. Warrant was most affected by rainfall, and Outlook was most affected by temperature. And GPA is not going to be super helpful for improving effectiveness of our residual herbicides. So with that, I am right at my 20 minutes limits, I think. Here's my contact information if you want to reach out. And, you can find more detailed information and conversations about these topics and a lot of others if you Google War Against Weeds and download some podcasts to listen to while you are driving down the road or planting crops or wherever your favorite time is to listen to stuff. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I will let Josh and Kathy determine if we have time for questions.
Yeah, I think there's a couple questions there, Sarah. You can either, if you want to pull them up, or I can read them either way.
Getting here now. Let's see. Oh, Kathy, thank you for dropping the link to the weed guide in the chat. That's great. Would it be fair to say that the colors on the atrazine map with mitigations are generated by a model created by the US EPA? These are not yet adopted and probably can't be at the earliest until 24. There remains a final publication. Yeah, that is absolutely right. So that is an EPA generated map. We could have a whole hours-long conversation about whether or not we agree with that map and how that map was created. But the reality is that's the map they're going with, based on conversations that I've had with folks in the agency. But yes, you're right there on the timeline as well. The comment period, I believe, just closed. And so the labels aren't going to change probably until 24, maybe 25. But I want to make sure that folks are not caught off guard by these changes, because I think they're going to be consistent across all the herbicides that are coming down the road. Go-to mix to control Johnson grass and shattercane. In corn, if you've got glyphosate resistant corn, that's a good way to go. The old standbys would have been nicosulfuron or accents. And if you can rotate out of corn, that's going to be the best chance to get it. And you can use some of the grass herbicides. So things like Assure or Select. So those are the couple of questions that I'm seeing. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Dan, who is waiting so very patiently. Thanks, Dan.
Sarah, real quick, you actually
Yes,
have
ma'am.
one in the Q&A window as well.
Ah, okay. I didn't see that one.
Yeah.
Thank you for pointing that out.
Sure.
Is it true that weeds don't know one group 15 herbicide from the other as they act on it in the same way? I understand there's a difference in performance, but if that's true, won't we see potential resistance develop? Especially as the chemical companies want us to keep raising rates and mixing different group 15s together. So that's a really good question. Really good question, both from an academic perspective and, an applied in the field perspective. So one of the things that we're starting to find in a lot of these cases where herbicides have multiple resistances is that they may be resistant to herbicides in one chemical family, but not another chemical family, even within one mode of action. Okay, so in the case of the group 15s, metolachlor and acetochlor, so Dual and Warrant, have the exact same chemical family. They're both chloroacetamides. Outlook is an oxyacetamide, so very similar, but slightly different. And then Zidua is a completely different chemical family. So there's less chance of a population being resistant to Dual and Zidua. There's more chance that it would be resistant to Dual and acetochlor. What we're finding is that we really tried to paint with too broad of a brush when we started with those recommendations for rotating modes of action, that it's really more fine-tuned than that. Goodness, there was another sort of part to that. About rates. So raising rates is good. One of the things to think about, one of the other questions that I get, and I don't have data to back it up, and so I'm not going to try to answer it, is do we use the same herbicide for a layered residual, or do we use a different one? So do we use Zidua at planting and follow up with acetochlor later in the season? And I think the answer is it depends on the conditions and whatever you think is going to give you the best control at the time, right? The thing we don't want to do is have, like, you don't want to apply a low rate of acetylchlorid planting and follow it up with another low rate of a super low rate, below labeled, below an effective rate later in the season. So yeah, those are all great questions and things that we talk about in weed science circles a lot. So I appreciate the questions.